We'll now pass over to a question and answer session. And the questions can come from people online and in the room. And may I remind those who are asking questions online to put your questions in the chat and to identify yourselves, because as I said earlier, we will be keeping a record of the questions and the answers.
Matthias Mossberg, already when he was tasked as an eminent person, concluded that while access was provided by the Swedish government, he was wondering that there is still classified material for which he was denied access. And Hans Christian Simonsen made similar observations, which nourish the suspicions that in military archives, in state security archives, there are documents where, for whichever reasons, and that provides, of course, sufficient food for speculations, which the reasons might be, access until the very day is denied. At a time when no one who was at that time living would be still alive, which would be one of the reasons to deny access to archives. The same is the case with the United Nations archives, where for a long time, while persons were still alive and mentioned in the documents, for strictly legal reasons, access was denied. We have reached a time where this is not any longer a reason. But we are left to speculate which documents might there be, as long as an eminent person or anyone else trustworthy is denied access to these archives to find out, which would be possible under an agreement of confidentiality, that such an independent person enters a commitment not to make public directly what's in the documents access, but it would give governments, not only in Sweden, the opportunity to come clean by showing a willingness to provide the access to the documents. That's the reason behind the Brunegard initiative, to demand to establish a truth commission, as we call it, to come clean with what happened 61, 62. And the beginning would be to allow access to documents still shelved and not accessible. When this Swedish commission discussed the findings in 1961 and 62 and made changes between the interim report and the final report, where it would be very interesting to highlight what motivated the changes made in that report, in deviation to earlier statements that were made in February 1962 in Geneva, and a final report which did not reflect the substance of the statements made in February 1962. And there would be, I guess, many more examples, and I'm sure the British and the US American colleagues, including some South African colleagues, would be able to give other examples and reference points where there is justified assumption that we have not access to all documents in existence and available.
I have a question for Alana. Something you said that I'm not quite clear. Maybe you could help me to understand. You said the Albertine may have been diverted leading to the Union Maniana official. What do you mean by that?
Maybe you could introduce yourself. This is on the record.
Yeah, I found a reference to this in the archives, in the UN archives, in November, last November, that there was a suggestion that somebody wanted the Albertina to be diverted. It said that Hammarskjöld could meet with a senior mining executive before he landed in Angola. And I think that there's also reference to this in the 2015 Commission report, but I don't know more about it, and I couldn't find the original file at the UN archives. That doesn't mean that it's not there, it's just that at that time, I only had a few days, I didn't find it.
We don't know if the planning ever went to meet a man page.
I mean, unless we could find our logs that would show that it landed somewhere else.
Yeah.
And where else would it land between Leopoldville and Envela? I mean, there are many other airfields there, but no, I
Do
don't.
we know who made the suggestion that he attend this meeting?
No, I found reference to it by somebody else in one of these meetings.
It would have been smart if Hammarskjöld had met them, don't you think? Since they were the driving force, as you explained, behind separatism.
Yeah, but then he's meeting with a non-state representatives on a state matter.
Which is why we don't know much about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would like to add a caveat on what I said before. We should not be misled, assuming if we are providing access to archives, we will find the answers, because it does not mean there is a guarantee we will find the documents which once existed. So that is part of the realities of the day. And having access, but not seeing documents which might have been there, but are quote unquote lost or removed or misallocated, means access to the archives is not necessarily the key to finding the truth. Unfortunately, we have to live with that sobering reality.
Stuart.
Yes, I wonder if I could just come in on the issue of the three countries that have been named as being unhelpful. And I can see that the US, the UK, and South Africa in this period and through the apartheid era had particularly close relations in intelligence. But I do see a sort of slight divergence in what both Henning was saying, and also I'd like to ask Alana on this, in terms of South Africa's position now. What was implied in what Henning said was that it was only the UK and the Americans who were standing aside from supporting resolutions, and there was a suggestion that perhaps South Africa politically is supportive of what has happened at the United Nations. Perhaps Henning could clarify that. The other question is, of course, that after apartheid, the whole question of trying to reconstitute the archives, much of which was burnt, of course, and destroyed deliberately. But it has re-emerged in surprising places, and I've done research in South Africa for my recent book, and there are records, and there is a lot of very good researchers in South Africa who are using the law and freedom of information access and so on to up some surprising documents. And I just and this is highly relevant to what Alana was saying in terms of the connections with South Africa, Anglo-American and so on. And I just wonder whether this difference in the three countries mentioned is relevant and might be a possible source of interest to us going forward from today. And I wonder if both Henning and Alana could just comment on it.
If I should start with the South African case, it is indeed different for obvious reasons from the British and the US American. The South African government has absolutely no reasons to cover up a history of apartheid crimes committed. So then one is puzzled what happened. And there is unfortunately not a straightforward, clear answer to that. It seems that archival material on these crucial days of 1961 and 62 is virtually absent from the records. And that might explain to some extent why so little has happened. But it does not explain why South Africa would not declare that it's simply impossible to trace anything. A South African historian made a couple of years ago an inquiry at the National Archives in Pretoria to look into the files which were there filed under Hammarskjöld. And the answer was, there is not a single file with reference to Dag Hammarskjöld. Now, Dag Hammarskjöld visited South Africa in 1961. There is sufficient evidence to that. And the National Archives in Pretoria say we have no file which makes reference to Dag Hammarskjöld. What do you make out of that situation? Couple of years ago, because of the non-responsiveness of South Africa to the request to appoint an eminent person, there were a few public statements made in the media, together with Chief Justice Goldstone, who was one of the four legal experts and a member of the Constitutional Court in South Africa, and together with Boni Pityana, who was the UN, the Human Rights Commissioner of South Africa. So two very high-ranking, very credible persons of absolute integrity. And in response, a spokesperson from DIRCO, that's the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was eager to say, of course we comply with the requests. That was the last we heard, and that was 3 years ago. So it's a little bit like shrugging shoulders in helplessness to explain, and efforts to find explanations in the foreign ministry, even by visiting them in person, showed a lot of goodwill, a lot of affirmation that this is important and South Africa would be interested to bring it into the public, without anything happening thereafter.
Yeah, I'm kind of, one of the things about South Africa here is that the archive is also gradually closing, right? So, I mean, the sooner that we can press for more access, the better it is. My feeling about this in terms of, asking states for access and then states denied for all the reasons that Henning has laid out, is that it's just an easy way for them to avoid revealing things that they don't want to reveal. And that doesn't mean that there's some smoking gun anywhere in there. It just simply means that they don't have the resources, they don't have the inclination, they don't have the political moment to do it. So what I find interesting about this trajectory of inquiry, and about the whole Congo episode in general, is that lots of other archives and states are really interested in this problem, right? So in Ghana, there's a huge file on the Hammarskjöld crash, and it's mostly a reproduction of the report that's in New York. But I mean, there's every single piece of paper that they could find about the crash is collected in file, labeled Hammarskjöld crash, and actually not labeled in the catalogue because of the resources of the Padmore Library being absolutely depleted. And so my effort, if I was to follow the paper trail, hopefully I will on this, would be to go to different types of archives, including in South Africa. So perhaps the Brenthurst Library in South Africa. I mean, they're hardly going to hand over anything that's highly controversial, but it might be worth looking at. The Gecko Mines Archive in Lubumbashi is another place I've tried to get access to. I haven't managed, but I know other people who have, not on this question, of course, but on other things. Certainly I'll go to the archives in Addis Ababa, given the tenor with which the Ethiopian representatives are pressing this issue of the Baga jet in the committee meeting. And so maybe the answer is not really in state archives. We could continue to press, South Africa, Britain, and other states, but they have the resources to say no. So maybe the way around it is to go to different types of archives where files are either wrongly labeled. When I found the Hammarskjöld file in the Padmore Library, they didn't know that they had it. So, I mean, I think there's a lot kept in African archives that we don't know about. Henning will know more about that, and of course the representatives from Zambia. And so maybe this is another place to look. And the other thing about it is that, again, I mean, Susan has written much more about this than I have, but the political activities of private corporations apart from a select number of books written on this from John Kent and others, it's not a hugely researched avenue of what's going on in Africa. And the UN reports that they write in ECOSOC in the second and third committees talk about the political activities of Anglo-American in particular as being absolutely vast. They view these organizations as being more powerful than most of the newly independent states, more powerful than the political actors themselves, because they believe that they wield the kind of economic influence that gives them an enormous amount of political leverage, and that they use that leverage right through the 60s and 70s. And so I wonder if, on the one hand, pressing some states to give the material is important, but maybe there's a way around that. And that's why I don't know if Moran is online yet, but I'd really like to hear a bit more about, he has done more research in the military archives in Belgium than I have in the Royal Archives. But I think also the Royal Archives in Belgium, there's 259 boxes on in Armenia. So I mean, perhaps this is also something that might reveal or offer a greater demonstration of their political power.
Thanks, Alana. We just have 1 minute left in this session, and I'd like, perhaps, Henning, you can have the final word.
Bishop Desmond Tutu raised the issue during the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, making reference to this dubious agency operating then in the late 1950s, early 1960s. That could not be verified. But it's important also to notice that the same problem exists with the best of intentions the governments are confronted with in Zambia and in Zimbabwe. I know from my own experience in Namibia, which I know best, that the last Administrator General before independence of Namibia removed files from the archives, which are simply not there any longer for the government which proclaimed independence. So we cannot assume that what happened then and was archived then in Northern Rhodesia or in Southern Rhodesia would have been there at sovereignty. So then the question is it worthwhile to look in colonial archives in London, looking maybe in some hidden corners that something might have ended up there where no one gets the idea, or I'm sure there are somewhere the idea. I look at Susan, I look at Mandy, of course there are those. But are there ways to find out that something exists which is not openly declared in the registry?
Thank you, Henning. And, that draws to a close the first session, and I'd like to thank everyone for your questions.